Felipe Martinez is a beggar in Venezuela. Every day he goes out to his corner and begs for food, clothes, anything. And the saddest part is, Felipe Martinez is just 7 years old. And in Venezuela, his story has become all too common. El País, a South American news source, explains on April 10th of 2018, the Venezuelan economic crisis has reached unprecedented levels, where hyperinflation, food, and housing instability have caused a refugee crisis to unfold. The Brookings Institution explains on April 15th of 2018 that today, 600,000 Venezuelan citizens have sought refuge in Colombia, and 800 have sought refuge in Brazil every single day over the last year. It's clear that Brazil and Colombia can no longer afford to ignore this Venezuelan economic crisis. Meanwhile, as Stratford Global Intelligence explains on April 10th of 2018, over the past month, 400 Venezuelan children have died of starvation, which means that 66 Venezuelan children have died of starvation since this tournament began. For then, we have to ask ourselves today's question. In light of increasing refugee traffic from Venezuela, what should Brazil and Colombia do to facilitate a stronger regional response to Venezuela's economic crisis? And the answer is clear. They need to utilize their unique geopolitical position to provide humanitarian aid in three critical ways. First, by setting up more refugee camps. Second, by investing in Venezuela's farmers. And finally, by straight up building housing. Now, the first way that ultimately Brazil and Colombia can create a regional response to provide humanitarian aid to alleviate Venezuela of its economic crisis is by setting up refugee camps. This has been an excruciating problem when it comes to this economic crisis. Chatham House explains on March 10th of 2018, because there are so many refugees, and Brazil and Colombia and other surrounding nations for Venezuela don't really have the infrastructure to handle this influx, this has not only become an economic crisis for Venezuela in and of itself, but for these surrounding nations, because they don't know how to handle this influx of refugees. They need a place for these refugees to stay while they are seeking refuge. And this is exactly where a transnational approach can come into play. The Center for Strategic and International Studies explains on April 2nd of 2018, Colombia has a ton of desolate property on its border with Venezuela. The problem is they don't have the funding to make these functional refugee camps. But Brazil has a ton of funds and no space. So this transnational approach can be Brazil helping increasing funding towards refugee camps on the border between Venezuela and Colombia. And they can also do so with other surrounding nations, like Guyana, which also lacks the funds, but has a ton of desolate space. And we've already seen this take effect. The Brookings Institution explains this time on April 17th of 2018, that there have already been $30,000 pumped into refugee camps on the border of Colombia, and that has saved 17,000 Venezuelan refugees. But this effort can be so much greater, and it's time for this transnational approach to occur, where Brazil funds refugee camps on Venezuela's border with other nations. But the second way that ultimately Brazil and Colombia can begin to increase their own geopolitical stance in providing humanitarian assistance for alleviating the Venezuelan economic crisis is by investing in Venezuela's farmers. Now, food insecurity, as I've already mentioned, is perhaps the largest concern when it comes to the Venezuelan economic crisis. And it's not only a matter of hyperinflation, because as the Peterson Institute for International Economics explains on April 11th of 2018, one of the primary reasons that food insecurity is so high is because farmers can't afford to increase their crop yields. They simply lack the supplies. But this is exactly where Brazil and Colombia come into play. Because as the Baker Institute explains on April 12th of 2018, what's unique about Brazil and Colombia's position is that they have a surplus of these farming supplies. So they can simply donate them as an investment to Venezuela's farmers and switch over to buying Venezuelan farmers' crops. For example, As was explained by the New York Times on April 16th of 2018, if Brazil and Colombia both increased their buying of Venezuela's crops by 5%, this could help increase these crop yields by 200-fold, ultimately alleviating Venezuela of its food insecurity. But the final way that Brazil and Colombia can begin to increase their own humanitarian assistance to alleviate Venezuela of its economic crisis is to straight up build housing. Now, housing instability is another major concern when it comes to Venezuela, especially why it's become a refugee crisis. As was explained by Reuters on April 6th of 2018, because almost 1 in 4 Venezuelan citizens are now homeless, that is the primary reason why they've been forced to seek refuge in these neighboring nations. What's the solution? Build housing. As was explained by the New York Times on April 6th of 2018, all Brazil and Colombia need to do is shell out roughly $2 million worth of funding, which really isn't that much for these massive nations, in order to construct actual homes and employ Venezuelan citizens who are currently homeless to ultimately help with construction projects. This would be a twofold economic benefit, because it would both create more housing and increase employment, something that can ultimately help Venezuela in the future. So when we return to today's question, in light of increasing refugee traffic from Venezuela, what should Brazil and Colombia do to facilitate a stronger regional response to Venezuela's economic crisis? The answer is to provide humanitarian assistance. First, with refugee camps. Second, by investing in Venezuela's farmers. And finally, by straight up building houses. Once they take these steps, then the Venezuelan economic crisis can begin to desist. And ultimately, stories like Felipe Martinez can disappear.